It's getting pretty chilly here in Scotland. So what sort of clothing might a 17th century Highlander wear in winter conditions? Well, stay tuned and let's discuss. Hi folks, Tom from Fandabi Dozi here with another video for the Highlander series, where I look at the typical 17th century Highlander in the context of wilderness living skills. So what sort of knowledge, equipment and skills did the average Highlander have as they're travelling through the Scottish landscape? So last month I did a hike up Ben Vorlich in some wet and wintry weather, and got lots and lots of questions, created some discussion about what was the exact things I was wearing, what people might have worn. So I thought I would do a wee video looking at the clothes in a bit more depth. First of all, the Highlander equipment in this series, I'm still learning as I go along and trying to piece little bits together. And I'm looking at historical references, but quite a lot of the time I have to kind of fill in the gaps with some speculation or looking at other cultures. And I want to be as historically accurate as I can in terms of the actual experiencing being outdoors in their clothing, but the small nitty-gritty stuff about the colours and the exact design I'm not too concerned about at the moment. So I'd first like to approach the subject looking at a modern survival concept which I like to think about when it comes to choosing clothing for cold conditions, and it's known as the 4 W's. And this is wick, warm, wet and windy, and I talk about it in my shelter video. So for example, if I was choosing modern clothing to go out on a hike in Scottish winter conditions, the wick would be your base layer. So this is a layer, something like a wool t-shirt or a synthetic t-shirt that wicks moisture away from your skin, keeping you warmer. And then warm, that would be a series of wool or synthetic material that helps trap dead airspace, keeping you insulated. And then finally wet and windy, that would be your shell layer, I like to call it. So something like a Gore-Tex jacket or waterproof jacket that stops the wet getting to your skin and also reduces the wind chill as well. So with those 4 W's in mind, let's look at the 17th century winter clothing. So the first W is wick, or the base layer. Now I couldn't really find much specific to the Highlands from my reading other than a linen shirt. But linen is not a good fabric for your base layer. Something like wool would be much better. And although I couldn't find anything specific to the Highlands, I read that something called a simmet was worn in Scotland in the 18th century, which is like a wool vest, and that would be much more effective as your base layer, keeping your core warm. Now, the second W, warm. Now obviously the more layers you have, the warmer you're going to be. Now, from my reading, it seems to be a waistcoat made from leather or wool was pretty common. Maybe some wool shirts, and then finally a thick wool jacket. On my hike I had a wool shirt and this wool jacket. And for the bottom half for warmth, I've read accounts of people wearing nothing in winter, but I've also read people might wear tartan trews, which I'll talk a wee bit more about later. Maybe stockings, maybe hose. And for your other smaller warm stuff, you've got your wool Highland bonnet, and then I probably would have guessed some sort of woolen mittens and woolen scarf if it got very cold. So finally, for wet and windy, or the shell layer, I would say the plaid or the plaidger would fit that bill. If you're new to my channel, I've got a whole video about this. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Check that out. The wool that they made the plaidger out of, it would have been treated by a process called walking, which causes the fibres to bind together, making it surprisingly waterproof, which I showed in my kilt tent video. There's a common story that people often tell me that people in the Highlands in very, very cold conditions would often deliberately dip their plaidger in a stream so that when it would freeze it would create a windproof shell. Now when I first heard this story, my BS alarm went off a wee bit, and from experience, wearing wool in cold conditions, it can create a sort of frozen crust on the outside which helps stop the wind get to you, but I just don't see why someone would deliberately make their plaid wet. If you're already freezing cold anyway, if the conditions are cold enough for your plaidger to freeze, then the river or stream is probably going to be frozen over. So you need to break through the ice, dip your plaidger in it, and then wrap up and hope that it's going to freeze and create a windproof shell. But if the conditions get cold enough this year, I'm totally up for trying it out and see if it's if it makes sense or if it's just a myth. So now I thought I'd cover some of the questions I got in my winter hiking video, because it covers some of the other items of clothing, and I went and tried to do some research to answer your questions. First of all, I wanted to cover the pronunciation of the plaid, or the plager, or the QnA. So many words. Language can be quite a tricky thing sometimes, because it's always evolving, and I want to be true to the names and the words that were used in the 17th century, but then I'm also aware that they become anglicised, and to be effective at communicating these things, I sometimes might need to use words that are more widely known today. So I've been referring to the plaid as the plaid, or the belted plaid, but I'm also aware that people call it the plaid. So I thought I'd very quickly look back at some of the Gaelic names and see how they have evolved into some of the English words that we call it today. So the three main Gaelic names that I found from my research are the Feely Moor, the QnA, and the plager. Now plager is blanket in Gaelic, and plager seems to have been anglicised into plaid and plaid. And then kilt, the word kilt seems to come from an Old English word, kiltin, which means to tuck up or just sort of gather in. So it could be referring to the pleats at the back of the kilt. So nowadays people might call it plaid, or the way I'd heard it is plaid, so that's why I've been referring to it as plaid. And then people say, oh, it looks like a modern day kilt, but it's big, so then people call it the Great Kilt. So not sure whether I should keep on referring to it as plaid, or maybe I should just refer to it as plager from now on. But I also found something interesting about the name QnA. Now brech means speckled, which is why the Gaelic for brown trout is brech, because they have wee speckles in their skin. So I wonder why it's called that. Maybe it's something to do with the colour of the fabric. Could be because the dyes that people use in the thread were not always consistent along it, so when you made a fabric, maybe the pattern would have been quite speckled. Speculation, but quite interesting. So I was going bare-legged in my winter hike video, so lots of people asked me, did Highlanders cover their legs with anything? And basically I found some cases of yes, and I found some cases of no. But even though on my hike it wasn't too cold, but I know if I was going any colder I'd definitely want to cover my legs with something. So let's look at that, and let's talk about trews. So the word trews comes from the Gaelic trúvash, which just means trousers. And some very early reports come from the Middle Ages, where people wore a sort of very loose-fitting tartan woolen trousers. In the 17th century, people did seem to wear them. People seem to disagree on sort of how commonly worn they were. From my readings, I saw a report from 1637 that someone said, in the sharp winter weather, the Highland men wore close trowses which cover their thighs, legs and feet. Now, there might be some different sort of variations what people wore. One style might have been just sort of long hose that came up, which were then tied to a sort of belt with linen cord. You also see in some old paintings that people were wearing very, very tight-fitting ones. That's because it was the way that the fabric was cut, so it clung to your leg. They also seem to be the preferred thing to wear if you're riding a horse, because you don't want to be riding a horse in a kilt with bare thighs for obvious reasons. And some of the styles of trews for people on horseback were often lined with leather in the inner leg to stop that rubbing. So then that leaves some people to believe that trews were for wealthier people, because if you were wealthy enough to have a horse, then you would wear trews to ride it. But in my opinion, I can see how the very nice fitting tight trews with the leather inner to ride your horse, I can see why that would be for a wealthier man. But then for the common man, I don't see why someone wouldn't have some very simple woolen hose or some sort of leg wraps or tartan trousers to keep that area warm. So far I haven't found any decent trews or woolen hose to add to my kit, so for the time being I'm just wearing some woolen long johns to sort of fit that role. Now what about footwear? Now all the historical accounts that I've read have just talked about some sort of very, very simple footwear made from deer hide or cow hide, often with the hair on the outside. I've got some questions asking about the shoes that are sort of precursor to the modern ghillie brogues, which is sort of more sort of sandally looking, where the lace comes up. I'm pretty sure people would have worn that. I also read accounts of people going bare feet. This is where you kind of need to speculate a wee bit. I mean, no doubt the people of Highlands were tough, but I doubt that they wore such very small, little dainty leather shoes in, you know, a foot of snow. So I would speculate that people would have wrapped their feet in sort of thicker leather boots, maybe stuffed them with sheep's wool or other things to keep your legs warm, but I haven't yet found any historical evidence of it yet. And finally, I got some questions. Did people wear animal fur in the 17th century to keep themselves warm? Now, I couldn't find any historical evidence of that, but you know, it doesn't mean that people didn't. In the 17th century, we'd already made quite a few animals extinct, but you know, people could have used deer skin, cow skin, sheep hide, rabbit hide, mountain hare hide, otter, seals. So there was animals available, and you know, I don't see why people wouldn't have used their skins, but I have no evidence of it again. So thanks very much for watching, folks. Hopefully you found some of it informative. Big thanks to everyone who gave me suggestions of what videos to do in the future, and everyone who sent me messages of encouragement and, you know, giving me ideas. Also want to say a big thanks to Janet83, who's very kindly put some subtitles to some of my past videos, so I really appreciate that. Thanks for the work, and I'll be back with another video as soon as I can. Cheers, folks.